Outside the room where Mark is going to present this talk today, and I am delighted to welcome each and every one of you to our 2021-2022 Irish Institute for Catholic Studies series of lectures. And we're beginning on a high because we have our visiting Professor Marc Hight here with us, and we have a big warm welcome to him and to his wife Paula. They come from the States, and we're thrilled to have them. And we're also delighted because for the first time we have students back on campus in Mary I, and we're also broadcasting from Mary I today, and Mark is here. So without further ado, I'll introduce Mark. And actually, can you let us know if any questions in the chat box? And we're recording this meeting today, and please know that your chat will be recorded and come up with it. So for the conversation at the end of this presentation, you have 15 minutes chat, you will not record that. So Mark is visiting professor at the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies. He's Thompson Professor of Theology in Sydney, Hampden College in Virginia in the United States of America. He's a distinguished philosopher with a track record of research in the area of philosophy. He has published the correspondence of Berkeley. He has a deep research and teaching interest in the philosophy of religion, in the history of philosophy, and in European philosophy. Today he's going to talk on an introduction to Berkeley philosophical theology. We're delighted to welcome.
Okay. So I think, so Trish, am I on, as they say? Okay, very good. Well, thanks very much to Dr. Kieran and to the IICS and all the members and staff here. I'm delighted to actually be here in Limerick at Mary Immaculate College, and pleased to deliver the inaugural lecture for this year, so to speak. And so I was asked to talk in particular about Ireland's perhaps most infamous, if not famous, philosopher, George Berkeley, the Anglican Bishop of Cloyne, here in Southern Ireland. But I do have a bit of a subtext in addition to sort of introducing Berkeley's philosophical theology, I'm going to use this as a springboard at the end to introduce a bit of my own research project, because I'm interested in a project concerning analytic theology that's inspired by Berkeley. And so hopefully all of that will become clear as we go. So with that, let's just start. I want to give you an overview of what's going to happen in the next 40 or 45 minutes or so. I want to just introduce Berkeley the person. It amazes me how few people know much about George Berkeley the person, but we'll correct at least a little bit of that today. Then we'll need to do a little bit of philosophy and metaphysics to get the backdrop of his immaterialist philosophy, which will then move us into his theological motivations. So Berkeley is an immaterialist. He believes that materialism in particular, we'll talk a little bit about what that means, is in fact not a good fit with Christian belief generally. Then we'll look with some of the details at a couple of Christian mysteries to show you how in particular I think that reasoning works in detail, and that will also be a little bit of a small segue. I hope to intrigue some of you, perhaps to maybe even contact me further for additional work there, and perhaps additional talks at Mary I. And that will culminate then with the Hight hypothesis, which is that good Christians ought to be immaterialists. So pardon me while I advance my stuff. So let's start with the beginning. Let's start with Ireland's perhaps most infamous philosopher. So George Berkeley, born in 1685 in Kilkenny. He did die in Oxford, but he spent the most part of his life here in Ireland. He was a member of the Protestant ascendancy. We won't hold that against him. He was the Dean of Derry, and from 1734, the Bishop of Cloyne. He was, as with many of the sort of enlightened people of the time, he hobnobbed with the literati. He was friends with Jonathan Swift, knew and corresponded with Alexander Pope, we've Addison, there are lots of sort of movers and shakers of London society. So Berkeley sort of moved in those literary circles. He's justly well regarded for his work in a wide variety of fields. Like many of the best minds of the 18th century, he wasn't just a philosopher, he dabbled in a wide range of fields. So here, just a few of them to give you an overview. His earliest work, The Essay Towards a New Theory of Vision, published in 1709. You do the math at the ripe old age of 24. So those of you who might be students, if you're not yet 24, you're behind. Right? The Essay Towards a New Theory of Vision was really quite smart and revolutionary, and was used as a textbook in Europe well into the 19th century. So important work. He did work in mathematics. His Analyst, published in 1734, which is a critique of the Newtonian version of the calculus using fluxions, is considered to be an excellent critique. He also proposed an alternative positive solution that's less well received, but he's an important person in the history of mathematics. He published in Physics and Mechanics with De Motu, and then, of course, perhaps most importantly, near and dear to my heart, are his views of political economy and Christian apologetics. His Querist, which appeared in 4 parts from 1735 onward, was concerned about how to reform the Irish economy, and to be more particular, the Irish political economy, including some of its political institutions, in order to help the plight of the Irish poor. And in this, he didn't discriminate. He was really interested in helping the poor Catholics of Ireland as well, and not just the members of his Protestant parish. And so he was engaged in Christian apologetics. He wrote the Alciphron while he was actually in the American colonies. He was attempting to found a college in Bermuda, St. Paul's College, to educate the colonists and the indigenous people in the British colonies in the area. But he decided to put it in Bermuda because it was equidistant from the Caribbean colonies to the New England colonies. But unfortunately, that put it far away from everything. And no surprise, the college never actually came to fruition. But then, of course, there's the Berkeley that we perhaps know most well, which is the philosopher, the immaterialist. His most important works are the Principles of Human Knowledge, and then the 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philonous, which outlined his major view, which is today known as immaterialism. So let's move to the second part. We have to have a little bit of a background about what immaterialism is in order to understand how Berkeley's theology sort of lives and moves. So according to immaterialists, there exist only 2 kinds of things in terms of fundamental reality. There are minds, which are things that perceive, right? Otherwise known as spirits or souls. And then there are ideas. Now, there's some controversy as to what ideas are, but this much we're very clear about. They're not substances. So I think the best way to think about it for our own purposes is that an idea is just a unit of content, sensory content in particular. So I might look at the gray of the screen, or the solidity of the wall, whatever might be the case, or the sounds that you have. Those sensory experiences become objects of knowledge and sensation and perception. And whatever that vehicle is that conveys that sensory experience, that's an idea. So the world consists of minds that perceive ideas. Now, the rival view is a materialist view. And materialism then goes another step. So, I'm sorry, I forgot my Aldous Huxley here. So, I mean, when people hear about immaterialism, that they're only minds and ideas, it means there's no matter. And people immediately go, that's absurd. Of course there's matter, right? But I will remind you with our dear friend Aldous that facts do not cease to exist because they are ignored. Which means there is a fact of the matter about whether or not there's matter, as I like to say, the fact of matter about matter, right? But assuming it's not sufficient, right? We need an argument, we need something to put together. So let's think a little bit more about this material substance that people have such deep intuitions about. A material substance is a mind-independent substance. That just means it exists even if there were no minds to perceive them, okay? That is extended and non-thinking. And the essential attribute of matter is extension. Right? It's got some extent on a vector in space. Okay? we're going to count as a materialist for my purposes today in interpreting and talking about Barclays theology as any view that posits the existence of matter. So, for instance, traditionally, most Christians are what we call dualists. They believe that there is mental substance, or mind, or soul, and then they, in addition, believe that there's material substance, which is going to explain the nature of body. So these people are materialists, as far as I'm concerned, because they posit the existence of matter. Okay. But to be clear about this and where Berkeley is going to move, we have to introduce and have a very good grasp on a fundamental distinction. And that's the distinction between physical and material. Okay, so the physical world pertains to the world insofar as it is experienced. Right, so the sciences tend to be physical sciences because they involve observations. But matter is not something you observe. Matter is that I know not what, which is mind independent, and whatever it is and however it works, it explains the order of the sensory perceptions that we actually experience. So the physical world then is just the world as experienced. The material world is a world of a substance that explains the physical experiences that we have. Now, the critical thing to understand here is that Berkeley is a physicalist. That is, Berkeley admits, absolutely, of course we have sensory experiences. We hear things, we touch things, we taste. All of those experiences occur in the richness, right, the panoply of amazing sensations that we have. But that doesn't necessarily entail that there has to be a mind-independent material substance that explains them. That's the key distinction. And you will find, I think, I'll give you an example here in just a moment, that when most people ridicule Berkeley, they misunderstand him because they conflate this important distinction. So, to give us a little break from doing a little metaphysics, I thought, fun fact, turns out that Berkeley here on the right and Joseph Butler on the left are actually co-honored with a feast today, the 16th of June, in the American Episcopal Church. So, sometimes fun facts are just fun, right? So let's get back to this conflation between the material and the physical. Perhaps the most famous example of this occurs with Dr. Samuel Johnson, who was a contemporary of Berkeley. And when he saw and read, okay, we actually have a pretty good reason to believe he didn't read. He just heard a synopsis of the Principles of Human Knowledge, Berkeley's first major work defending immaterialism. And he went up to a rock and he kicked it. And he said, I refute him thus. Okay, this is a very famous story. It's not even apocryphal, apparently it's true. This is a lovely statue of the event by William Falk. You can see this. It's in England, even though he passed away not too long ago. He's done some lovely work for those of you who like sculpture. Okay, so let's go back to this stone kicker, right? This Samuel Johnson. Okay, Johnson's completely confused, because he has made exactly the mistake that Berkeley warns us not to make. He has conflated the physical with the material. So we think, Berkeley indicates that there are minds, and then there are ideas that represent sensory content. Okay, well, is kicking a stone involving sensory content? Yes, of course it is, because when you stub your toe, you have a sensation of solidity, perhaps of pain. Berkeley doesn't deny that you will have all of those sensory experiences. Of course you will. That's a part of our lived experience. Berkeley only denies that this stone that you kicked is in addition some bit of matter, whatever that means. Okay? So he's got this completely wrong. Well, so if we think about this ourselves, what is matter? Well, you can go to your science faculty, right? And they might tell you, well, I'll tell you what matter is. It's force divided by acceleration. Oh, that's nice. What's force? Well, it's mass times acceleration. Well, that's not very useful now, is it? So we used to think that matter were atoms, and then we learned, okay, it's not atoms. It's subatomic particles. Okay, well, it's not subatomic particles. It's muons, and gluons, and quarks. And now, okay, well, now maybe it's fields and strings. Okay, these are all formalizations that make the mathematics work. But none of them are anything in terms of a model of the world. So matter, the word, is just a placeholder in physics as it is in philosophy and elsewhere. And it means whatever it is in reality that explains the observations that we have. Berkeley, well ahead of his time. Okay? So, science studies the orderliness and connectedness of what we observe. Science does not look at muons. It does not look at strings. It performs experiences that have predictive observational upshots. In other words, sensory experiences. So we have today lots of work in the sciences. It's called scientific instrumentalism, which is a view that runs exactly in tandem with what Barclays advocate. Okay, so part of the reason I spend the time to talk about that is because I want to persuade you that Barclays' position might be controversial, but it's not nearly as controversial as you might think, and it's certainly not like refutations are kicking stones, right? It's still engaged today. Okay? Places where it's principally engaged are in philosophy and science, to a lesser degree, but I hope an expanding degree, theology as well. So, another fun fact, there's another Dr. Samuel Johnson, and he was an American theologian that Berkeley met when he came to Rhode Island in the early 1730s. He later became the first president of King's College, but after that late rebellion turned into Columbia University. So just fun facts. So now that we've got a little bit of an introduction to Berkeley, we've got the immaterialist metaphysics, and we understand this distinction between physical and material, we're now ready for Berkeley's theological program. So, supposing that matter exists, says Berkeley, is rife with problems. It's going to cause problems like incoherence. It's going to make people think that Christianity is inconsistent. It's going to tempt people to the two twin evils of the day, which are skepticism and atheism. Okay? So, here is Berkeley. I'm going to apologize. Some of the slides are now going to be a little text heavy, but that's just to give you a sense that I'm not lying to you about Berkeley, right? And so you don't have to read all of that. Where I can, I'll give you some emphasis, like for instance here. He says, look, I can give you proof against the existence of matter. Why? Well, because I can instance several of those errors and difficulties, not to mention impieties, which have sprung from that tenet of matter. So what I'm suggesting to you is that Berkeley's philosophical theology is driven by his metaphysic, right? Which indicates there's no such thing as matter. Okay, so let's continue. So what his lessons is that if we rely upon these material intuitions, we're going to get ourselves into theological trouble. And that's basically what happens. So I've already indicated what are the two twin evils: skepticism, atheism. All right, how's that going to work? Well, you might think it's sort of like, yeah, my dog ate my homework. I don't know about any of you in the audience, but I've actually had one student tell me that an animal of his ate his homework. What am I supposed to think about that? I'm a little skeptical. A little skeptical about that. So is that the sort of skepticism we're talking about? Well, in a sense, yes, it is. But more importantly, we want to be clear about why it is that Berkeley thinks that skepticism and atheism follows from materialism. All right, let's come back to our little fun dog eating our homework analysis, right? So it's actually the little subtext here that I want to emphasize. That's why I like it so much. So if we can doubt it, the poster says that it probably isn't true. So this is exactly Berkeley's thinking, okay? So if matter, or the supposition of matter, the intuitions that we have about matter, make us doubt, then it's very natural to go from that doubt to denial. And of course, what is the denial? Well, religion and God. So in other words, skepticism is going to push us to atheism. So let's be yet more clear about that particular move. Let's take a step back. So when we think about our religion and our theology, there's a nice divide, okay, between natural religion and what we call revealed religion. So natural religion concerns truths that can be discovered and proven by reason. So God, upon our creation, endowed us with faculty of reason. Thus, we can engage and explore and understand creation. But that is subject to things like logic and argument and analysis. That's why we have that faculty to use it. Okay? Revealed religion, however, concerns truths that are made accessible to us, especially through Scripture, also perhaps through the Church Fathers, right? That are not demonstrable by reason. So, for instance, of the Christian doctrines that are revealed, we have the incarnation of Christ, the nature and fact of the Holy Trinity. We can talk about the promise of bodily resurrection and transubstantiation, and miracles. There's lots of really fun topics there that we're going to talk about. Now, what Berkeley wants to argue is that these two have to work hand in hand. Can't have one without the other. Makes good sense, okay? Truths of revealed religion are only known through revelation, right, until we come to the right hand of God. But they can be made understandable. They can be made plausible in the interim, right, in our finite lives. And so, to use Berkeley's words, they can be shown to not be contrary to reason. That's the critical move. So, as we continue. So, what does that mean? Well, when it comes to natural religion, it's really quite simple. It's a very easy bar. Christian doctrines can't entail contradictions. So if someone came up to you and said, oh, 2 plus 3 equals 5, oh, and by the way, 2 plus 4 equals 10, you should be skeptical, right? You should absolutely be skeptical. That seems contradictory. And if it turns out that somebody's religion is based upon the core revealed truth that 2 plus 4 equals 10, I wouldn't blame you if you didn't believe, right? So it's pretty straightforward, right? It's not a difficult bar. We should expect then that our Christian doctrines won't be internally contradictory. So nothing that we find revealed in nature is going to do that. Now, there's also the other side of that problem, which is it also needs to exclude fideism. Now, this is a little bit more of a difficult sell. So fideism is the view that the nature of God and God's commands are in fact beyond human comprehension. Okay, that's fideism. Now, I'm not going to tell you that fideism and fideistic beliefs are false, but I am going to tell you that if you're a fideist, you might as well, turn off and go do something else. Because what's the point of talking? If you're telling me that everything about the nature of God is beyond all human ken, what you're telling me is that we should stop talking. So you tell me, for instance, that God is love. But of course, I can't know what that means because God's beyond all human understanding. So Christianity then can't embrace contradiction. And on the other side, it can't embrace fideism completely. Now, don't be confused. Fideism is not the same thing as having faith. You can have faith without being a fideist. Right? This is critically important, especially in the primary Christian tradition, which makes room for both natural and revealed religion. Okay, great. So we're clear about that. It really matters. So here's Berkeley in the Alciphron. He says, all right, we can prove that God exists. That's within our ken. Right? But when it comes to his nature and mysteries in religion, right, the Christian mysteries, the revealed truths, he says we can't do that. But it is sufficient, in red, if we can show that there is nothing absurd or repugnant in our belief of those points. Right, so in other words, this is just Berkeley reinforcing what I've already introduced so that you know I'm not prevaricating. Right, so there's Berkeley telling you what I said, he said. Gotta have both, natural and revealed religion. All right, so Berkeley's task then, in his philosophical theology, is to show that those Christian mysteries do not entail contradictions if you're a materialist. And, comma, if you're a materialist, you're much more likely to run afoul of those problems. So it's just that simple. So we're going to try to do that while we preserve the mysteries, right? We still want the wonder that inspires faith. We don't want to reduce Christianity to naturalism, but we also don't want to reduce Christianity to incoherence. So that's sort of the road we're sort of slipping between. And so when I first saw some of these Christian mystery books, I thought, I've been struggling with the Trinity now for well over a year or two. I thought, well, there it is! The Christian mysteries explained in these books. It's not like that at all. It's sort of like Hardy Boys type sorts of things. So not those kinds of Christian mysteries, as interesting and as fun as they are. So let's talk then about the direct theology. So the strategy is to show us why we don't need matter. This is going to have two prongs. On the one hand, he's going to argue that matter is odious baggage. That is, it is explanatorily idle. It does no work. I could explain anything with immaterialism that you could explain with materialism. Therefore, I don't need materialism. That's the weaker version. But Berkeley also more strongly believes that he can demonstrate that the notion, the concept of matter itself is impossible. Okay, so this is not a talk about that metaphysics, but that's sort of his sort of twin lines that occur in the principles and the three dialogues. Okay, so why this? Well, I want to go back to a point I touched on a little earlier. The threat is what he's trying to counter. The moment you allow the existence of matter, material substance that is mind-independent, external, right, extended, you allow skepticism, and you allow a view of the world that makes it not dependent upon God. There the specter of atheism rises, right? So upon the same foundation of materialism have been raised all the impious schemes of atheism and irreligion. Berkeley is nicely clear about all these sorts of things. How materialism is the friend of atheists. So, once you allow the existence of material substance, the need for an omnipresent mind or spirit starts to fade. So, imagine that all the miracles that Christ performed could be perfectly explained by material laws today. Well, you've lost a primary drive of what sort of motivates faith. Imagine that the universe doesn't need an omnipresent mind, because once you posit matter, everything that we experience in the world can be explained without it. If you can doubt it, it's probably not true. Remember that little line from the Skepticism poster? This is what Berkeley's worried about. He says, all right, if you allow matter, you're going to allow people to conceive of the world without God. The moment you allow people to do that, it's a slippery slope. I'd say we're going straight to hell, but of course they wouldn't think that either, right? So we wouldn't need God. That's the worry. So what we're going to do is we're going to show that this material substance is either explanatory, idle, or doesn't exist. And ultimately, and this is just, you don't have to read through that. I know it's a lot of text, I apologize. But whether or not Berkeley has proven the material substance does or doesn't exist, whether it is or isn't explanatory idle, we've met my goal, which is to show what the theological motivations are that are pushing Berkeley's theology along. And because material substance is necessary for atheism, that's what's doing the work. Okay. Believe it or not, we've now finally arrived at the point where we can talk about theology, right? We can talk about the doctrines themselves. So I have a number of sample topics sort of lined up for us to discuss. How many we get through depends upon how much time we've got. So I'll mention probably all of them, at least just a little bit, plus there's more I haven't even planned to discuss today. If there's something there that you would like to discuss further, I would encourage you to reach out to me. That's why I'm here, and whether it's you hate it, you love it, it doesn't matter. I'm a philosopher. Criticism is just what I do. So what he's going to do in each and every case is he's going to show that materialism generates problems. In particular, he's going to be worried about contradiction, right? Okay. Then he's going to show that if I let go of the materialism, I can still have a coherent account that's not fideistic, that's not contradictory, but is also scriptural and fits with our standard Christian theology, right? So that's the challenge. That's the theological sort of moves that we're moving on. And so, of course, I love the Black Sabbath album cover, for those of you who remember vinyl. You know, the angels that are smoking and gambling, right? Someone once asked me, well, where's the one who's drinking? I said, oh, we have the angels there. It's just passed out on the other side of the bench. So let's talk about them. So Trish in particular asked for a little discussion about bodily resurrection. So we're going to start with that. Okay, so what's the promise of this Christian mystery? Well, after judgment, right, Christ returns, we have Judgment Day, we are promised biblically that the body will be resurrected, and more specifically, it won't just be a body or any body, it will be your body. Bible's very clear about this. Okay? The passages that Berkeley engages here are listed. There are actually a couple of others. And here we can see a fanciful rendition of Paul being resurrected and taken to heaven. Okay, so why is that a problem? Well, it's not just a problem. There are at least 3 well-known versions of problems with the general resurrection of the body. So, the first I'm going to call the recycling problem. Now remember, I'm talking now about problems generated by Christians who are also materialists. All right? So it's not a problem with the doctrine per se, it's a problem with the doctrine when you are ontologically a materialist. So the first one's the recycling problem. So imagine, you're walking out one fine day, Ian, and unfortunately you get hit by a tractor and you die. So they go out, it's a sad event, they bury you. Okay? And you rot away. Okay? Into the soil goes your matter, which then gets pulled into the plants, who use the carbon and the nitrogen and the stuff from your body to grow. And lucky you, there's sheep in the field. And then the sheep eat the grass, which has little bits of former Ian in it. And then that goes into some really tender chops, right? And then Trish comes along and has a lovely meal, right? And she eats. She eats the mutton, which was previously you, and then, unfortunately, lightning strikes, and she just falls down dead right there. Time passes, resurrection occurs, lovely, but you're resurrected in your body. So who gets the bits, right? So it's not possible to share them, or if it is, it's going to be a mighty odd, right, resurrected state. So we have, this is known as the recycling problem. Now you might think, oh, well, that's a fanciful thing for a 21st century person to think about. No, actually, the first person I'm aware of to directly engage this problem is St. Thomas Aquinas, who directly is concerned with this problem. Right? All right, so forget that. Let's move then on to the second problem. It's the punishment problem. The damned must have their bodies to suffer in the afterlife. You might also call this the felicity problem, because analogously, those who are saved and taken to heaven need bodies in order to enjoy the felicity of the afterlife. And so I would have to do some biblical exegesis and talk about some of the doctrines, but the scriptures are fairly clear that in order to be punished, you have to have a body that undergoes torment. And so we'll just run with this at the moment. Okay, so why is that a problem? Well, but that means there's got to be a place, a material place, where your body is punished. It might be lake of fire, eternal torments, whatever the case might be. But remember, to go all the way back to the beginning of my talk, material substance is extended. So it has to have, literally, an extended place. Well, even in Barclays' time, in the 18th century, people had already done calculations about the size of the center of the Earth, and it was already full. So if hell were in the center of the planet, where is it going to be? And so we have in the 17th century this lovely display of rival theories about the location of hell. Some people put it on a comet, some people put it on the sun. It's really a fascinating set of reads. But this is a problem if you're a materialist. You now have to literally locate hell. Likewise, you're going to have to literally locate heaven as well. Okay, we'll pass by that. Lastly, let's talk about the fit state problem. In what state will you be resurrected? Let's go back to poor Professor Hickey, who has just been hit on the side of the road. But it turns out that the damage from being hit with this thresher, or whatever foreign implement it was, has made him a quadriplegic and hunched and has all sorts of problems. When he's resurrected, is he resurrected as a quadriplegic? Well, remember, you have to be resurrected in your body. Well, the last thing he remembers in his body is the body that can't move any of his arms or legs. We can also think, what about the little children? Right? So if you die at the age of 3, are you resurrected as an immature and not fully rational individual? That doesn't seem right. That seems problematic. But the materialism seems to incline in that direction. So hopefully at this point we can see some possible problems or even inconsistencies with the supposition of the Christian doctrine of bodily resurrection and the material substance on the other. Okay, so here's Berkeley, who at least is very clear about this case. If you take away material substance, right, and you mean by body what every plain ordinary person means, namely what is immediately seen and felt, right, those ideas, then all of the unanswerable objections come to nothing. Okay, well, let's see if he's right. Let's see if we can do a little bit here. So, if bodies are just collections of ideas, right? So, I have a certain sort of sense of feel, whether it might be kinesthetic or visual, whatever the case might be, that I associate with myself. Those then becomes my body. If you actually read the scripture carefully, and you can go back and you look at the Greek or whatever the case might be, God's promise is not that your matter will be returned to you. It's actually quite clear. God's promise is that your body will be returned to you. But Barclays is a physicalist and not a materialist. Your body is just a collection of ideas. So all that God owes you in his promise is to return to you your set of sensory ideas that you associate with your body. Well, now that's nice, right? And so here's Barclays' letter to Johnson. I could come back. So how is this going to solve our problems? Well, there's going to be no problem with whether or not we have Ian Hickey bits in for Trish at the time she gets resurrected. We don't have this problem because we don't have to track bits of matter. All that matters is that the ideas that God puts in relationship to Ian's mind are recognizably his body, to him. And the same thing is going to be true for Professor Kieran. So, also, everyone has a body in the afterlife, so we don't need a literal location. We just need a figurative place for heaven or hell. Because what is hell? It's a place where you're going to experience punishment. But the experience of punishment only requires that the ideas that you are put into a perceptual relationship with are particularly unpleasant. Likewise with heaven. Heaven is not a location, it's a place. By which I mean it's not located in an extended universe, it's located in a universe where God arranges those felicitous ideas. And furthermore, there's nothing that prevents God from putting us into a perceptual relationship with kinds of ideas that we otherwise are not able to experience as ordinary humans, but upon our resurrection are able. That's a kind of felicity that you can't even imagine at the moment. Not precluded by this doctrine. So, Berkeley, by the way, argues for the plausibility of the promise of general bodily resurrection. I've done some work on that if you're interested. There's the citation. But I'm not going to talk much about that, right? Sort of with Dr. Slattery here at the memorial for at Oxford, Christ Church Cathedral in Oxford. Berkeley's actually buried just a little bit off to the left in the floor in this particular picture. So a little shout out to Dr. Slattery there. So what about the incarnation? I think we have time to talk about it, probably at least maybe one more, right? So let's talk about the incarnation. So the doctrine of the incarnation is that there's one person, Christ, that has two natures. Those two natures are wholly human and wholly divine. Okay, not H-O-L-Y, although that's true too, but W-H-O-L-E, right? Whole. So he's acknowledged the two natures. Now the yellow bit is what's worrisome. Without confusion, without change, without division, or without any separation, Christ has both natures. Okay. Why is that a problem if you're a materialist? Oh, I'm sorry. So somebody complained that when I talked about this, well, if you're talking about Chalcedon in 451, that's very Catholic. What about the Anglicans? No, the Anglicans in the Article of Faith believe the exact same thing. There's no difference there. That's all that that's meant to do. We don't need to read that. So, what are the problems? Well, if you're a materialist, Christ, qua man, has a material body. Right? That's what it means to be a materialist. But if you're also an Orthodox Christian theist, Christ, qua divine, is wholly immaterial. The Bible's quite clear about this. It even uses the word from the Greek that literally means not material. Immaterial. That's how it's translated in the NIV and stuff like that. So, wait, that's the problem. If Christ is one that has a material body, at least in part, but is wholly immaterial, well, that seems contradictory. That seems like it's a problem. Okay, we're going to solve this problem? Of course we are, right? We wouldn't be here if we weren't going to solve this problem. So we've got this scriptural contradiction that we're dealing with if we're a materialist. Great. So let's make it worse before we solve the problem, shall we? So a complication. There's a very long tradition in Christianity that associates the material world with corruption. Or even, I mean, it's got like, you know, in Catholic theology, there's a name for everything. Everything has a name, as far as I'm concerned, especially when it comes to heresy. Right? These are sort of Gnostic views, right? So mysticism, but Docetism in particular is this claim that matter is corrupt, and that's why Christ couldn't be fully incarnate. That's heresy. Right? So we're going to try to avoid that. Now, there are a lot of very smart, well-known Christian materialists, who I call the Christian material apologists. Eleanor Stump, Peter Van Inwagen, I actually studied and worked with them, Tom Morris and others, are trying to be material monists, or dualists, depending on who they are, and still defend the coherence of the incarnation. So I want to be honest and tell you there is a literature out there that takes a different path than the one that I'm engaged in today. So, okay. I would be happy to talk further about some of their views, some of them which are deeply weird, which is why I like them. My favorite is Peter Van Inwagen has what I call the meat locker theory of resurrection, where when you die, God takes your matter at the moment you die, whisks it away to what I call the meat locker in the sky, creates replacement matter where you were, so that way there's no recycling problem. And then upon the promised judgment day, all the bodies are taken out of the meat locker and are reunited with their souls. I find it deeply weird. I find it, I enjoy it a lot. I do, but I find it deeply weird. Okay, so how are we going to solve this problem if we're an immaterialist? No worries, because bodies are just collections of perceived ideas. So what does it mean to say that Christ is incarnate, that is embodied? Well, it means that Christ has a set of sensory ideas that are just like the sets of sensory ideas that other finite minds, right, like all of you and me, have. So when Christ came to earth and was made incarnate, what does that mean? Well, all that it means is, if you're a materialist, is that Christ restricted his range of perceptual experiences to those sensory experiences that ordinary finite minds have. What's nice about this is that restricting the set of sensory ideas that you have does not entail precluding the possibility that there are others. So God is omniscient. Christ, presumably, right, is omniscient. But Christ incarnate voluntarily chose to restrict the range of sensory ideas that he perceived for a given amount of time while on earth. Notice that there's no contradiction between that, because Christ then, there's a sense of Christ's sacrifice was the sense of restricting the sensory order that Christ engaged for a period of time. Now, this is going to actually be really nice in terms of our theological upshots, or at least I will argue, because it's going to enable us to have God, via the Son, right, to experience even the suffering of humanity. So, standard theology, certainly standard Catholic theology, argues that patri passionism is a heresy. God does not suffer. Okay, so God knows of pain, but God does not endure, undergo, or literally suffer pain. This is a bit of a worry, especially if you're a materialist, because then what was Christ doing on the cross if not suffering? And the answer now, the immaterialist has a perfectly reasonable explanation for this. Christ voluntarily took this upon himself as a part of sort of the soteriology, right, the salvation, right, mission of Christ. And that's not inconsistent with Christ nonetheless being wholly divine, right? Because Christ is just restricting himself for the moment. And it's a voluntary free decision that Christ makes, even though it doesn't preclude otherwise the divinity of God. So, now I have to be clear here. Berkeley does not explicitly endorse this story that I've just told you about. Okay? That's a very Heightastic, that's my sort of adjective for views that I hold. reading of what's going on, inspired by Berkeley, but it's in line with that theology. And so remember what I promised you at the beginning, that this little subtext here, as I'm trying to sort of prepare you for some of the work that I'm now doing in contemporary theology. This is one of those bridge views. Okay, so the advantages of this account is that it's going to be perfectly reasonable as a matter of metaphysics and logic. There's no actual contradiction. Right? Material, wholly immaterial. Nope, you don't have a problem there, because it's just the objects of perception that leaves the mind alone. And what makes me most excited about this view is that it leaves the mystery of the incarnation in the right place, right? Why would God be tempted to only associate with a finite series of ideas? How could the Son be fully human and yet one substance with the Word that upholds creation? Those mysteries are still there. Those are still questions to be asked and answered. But what my reading of the incarnation does under an immaterialist metaphysic is it removes the contradiction that seems obvious from our initial presentation. Right, that's the motivation for Barclays theology, and what I'm trying to suggest to you, it ought to be the case for immaterialist metaphysics generally. Okay, so I'm drawing near the end of my time here today, and I want to make sure that if people want to discuss things, excited to do that. So I'm going to whisk through a couple of other topics. So for instance, the literal location of heaven and hell, I invoked that earlier in terms of the promise of bodily resurrection, but it turns out there are additional interesting issues and puzzles and problems. We can talk more about that later this fall if you want. So there's lots of neat things about that. We're going to just move through, with my apologies. Where's hell? Right? And then lastly, I wanted to at least give mention to this because this has been what I've been working on mostly lately, is the Trinity. So a lot of people who weren't reared in the Christian faith sort of look at the Trinity and go, well, I can't imagine a more obvious contradiction than that, because 3 does not equal 1. And then you talk about hypostases and people versus substances, and that just doesn't seem to help. Right. It's a really hard doctrine to wrap one's head around. And I want to suggest that despite the apparent contradictoriness of the Trinity, if you're an immaterialist and you personalize the nature of God as a loving being, you can avoid the contradiction, while, just like with the incarnation, preserving the mystery. That's a tall order. That's a talk for another day, I dare say. So I've got a little background of some of the solutions to the problem of the Trinity, how we might move forward as a materialist, and we're ready for the end of this talk. So summary and conclusion. Berkeley has good reasons, I think, for worrying about the compatibility of materialism and Christianity. And this is what motivates his philosophical theology. Immaterialism, in addition, has resources to make the Christian mysteries more plausible. So I'm not going to make the claim that, oh, absolutely, this is Christian apologetics, it saves Christianity. Absolutely not. I'm just suggesting that there is an important philosophical, logical fit that works with immaterialism and Christian theology. And thus, I leave you with the Hight hypothesis that contemporary theological and philosophical work inspired by Berkeley pushes us to this interesting, intriguing conclusion that needs a lot of defense, namely, that good Christians ought to be materialists. So, and with that, I'm only a minute over. I thank you very much for your time.